the world isn't asking anyone to come up with a new and better guitar, really, or a new and better chair. It doesn't value them that much. We go into the studio because we expect to come out of the other end of the creative process different ourselves, knowing more or somehow being different.
I'm very pleased to have Peter Korn as my guest on this week's episode of Life with Strings Attached. Peter Korn is a master craftsman, author, and the founder of the Center for Furniture Craftsmanship in Rockport, Maine, where he served as executive director from 1993 to 2021. With a career spanning decades as a furniture maker, educator, and leader, Peter's work has been exhibited nationally and celebrated for its artistry. He is the author of Why We Make Things and Why It Matters, a profound exploration of craftsmanship's transformative power, as well as several influential woodworking guides. Peter continues to inspire a new generation of makers while he designs furniture and shares his knowledge through workshops. I thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with Peter Korn. I hope that you do as much as I did. Peter.
Good morning, Jamie. Well, good morning for me.
Yeah, good morning for you. You can still say good morning to me. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Okay.
Welcome to Life with Strings Attached. We appreciate you being here. How are things in Maine?
Well, it's been how can I say it? The external environment is, we just finished an election, as you know.
Yes.
So there's a lot to adjust to, so to speak. And right, the world's a little different. But things in Maine are quite lovely, as always.
Yeah, I've been traveling to the U.S. for many, many years, and I don't know any other place in the world that I've traveled to that feels their elections as much as the U.S. does. And I've been there for many elections, actually. I've been in the country over many nights. I was there. I remember I was in Nashville when Obama was elected, on that. I was actually there both times he was elected. I was in the U.S., and, I remember where I was the first time Trump was elected and so on and so forth. And there's a real big holding of the breath that happens in America that's different than anywhere else in the world I've ever been to.
I wasn't aware that it's different in other parts of the world, but I'm always glad when the election is over and we at least know what the new reality is going to be. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So has that all been confirmed now? It's
yes.
Official? Oh, it's been announced. Okay, and
Donald Trump won.
And Donald Trump won.
Just in case that news hasn't gotten to you yet.
Okay. Well, you see a little bit of it, but there's a little bit of distrust of news in general right now, right? So it's like I quickly saw something over lunch, but I was eating my pasta, and I wasn't. I'm a foreigner, so it's a bit of distant news. It's relevant, of course. Business really changes close to the elections. Things slow down, as I said, because everyone kind of holds their breath a little bit and people stop spending. They start for whatever reason, and then things start to roll again shortly thereafter. And so it's, I've experienced that many times over, not as many times as you have, of course, and not as real as you have. But the news cycle in general, even if it's not politics, America lives with news. When you're in an American hotel, it's at the breakfast buffet. When you're in an American bank, it's in the lineup at the bank. It's not like that anywhere else. There's a constant news cycle that you guys are subjected to.
Well, there was a book that came out in the early to mid 70s called "Within the Context of No Context," which you would enjoy reading if you haven't, by George W.S. Trow Jr., who was at the time a staff writer for the New Yorker. And what he was writing about, and I never know whether the word is prescient or prescient, but presciently was the way in which in contemporary life we each tend to live in a mental relationship to the entire nation and the news of the entire nation, where previously we lived in communities where we had layers of belonging in our lives. And with those churches, Rotary clubs, whatever else, right? Local football teams, as those things have been removed and we think of ourselves as part of the whole, the national news has kind of become everything. which is not necessarily a good thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm in Europe right now, and here again, it's a bit different in the way that the Europeans seem to all be very aware of the other European countries in a way that I don't know. There's just an awareness, almost like how the Americans are aware of each other's state in a way, much more than they're aware of countries outside of the USA in the same way. Europeans, Europe does really operate kind of as a whole in an awareness that's interestingly different anyways. I've maybe had the benefit of growing up in one of the most peaceful times in history, and in Canada, one of the most sort of recognized peaceful countries in history. And we have this kind of unawareness of politics for the most part because there's not a big problem to deal with. And so as a result of it, I as I get older, I realize it's probably not a good thing. I think, I don't remember which ancient philosopher it was, but basically said that those who don't participate in politics are destined to be led by fools. But
actually, I think those who do participate in politics are also likely to be led by fools.
So there's no winning in that scenario. So
which calls all the more attention to the value of living an individual life well. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a sort of ongoing historical point of view of philosophers.
Yes.
Absolutely. There I go. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, that's really the impetus for our conversation, isn't it? So, you wrote a book, Why We Make Things, Why It Matters. I have the European copy here, which looks different than my copy that I got in Canada. I don't know. I presume you've seen the different covers of your book from around the world.
I'm happy to hold it up if you want to see it. Yeah.
Yeah. You have that one right beside you also?
Right here on the shelf. Yeah.
Yeah. The one I have at home, I'm sure, is white. And it made me second guess myself when I saw this one.
This is the original
that's
cover.
What I have. Yes.
And each of those tools belonged to someone I knew. And so it has a value beyond the fact that it's a representation of one arena of visual arts or creativity.
Yes. So we could dive into that even. So that's really wonderful. I know many craftspeople who have a particular emotional attachment to a particular tool that they have, where they got it, who it came from. They have some of the latest and greatest technology, but this one was their grandfather's block plane. And even though it may not necessarily compete directly with the latest and greatest machined block plane, that's the one they use because they have an attachment to it. And
I'm the same. Yeah.
You are. Yeah. And so you have a number of. Are all of the tools you use sort of collected along the way? Do you replace them with more meaningful versions?
Every woodworker has a different way of approaching the work in terms of how much they might choose to combine hand skills with machine work. Mm-hmm. And I'm somewhere in the center of that, meaning I apply hand skills a lot, but I also use machines a lot. And in my hand tools, I have a screwdriver that was given to me early on in my career by my mother's second husband. And I have a gauge, marking gauge. Well, I have a mortise gauge, which I bought, one of the first tools I bought in 1974 from a woodcraft store in Boston. I was living in Nantucket at the time. Mm-hmm. And why that's meaningful in a certain way is in 1974 in this country, there was only one place in the entire country where you could buy hand tools of the traditional sort, like mortise gauges, marking gauges, cutting gauges. Mm-hmm. And that was this tiny little store in Woburn, Massachusetts called Woodcraft, which I drove up to. And over the next 30 or 40 years, there was this explosion of interest in woodworking, and Woodcraft became a national chain, and many other stores came up. And it's interesting to have been in woodworking when it was so minimal, creative woodworking, and now to see how, like other crafts, and other areas of creativity, it's exploded.
Mm-hmm, one of the reasons we're talking is because of the parallels that run between the studio craft furniture movement and the handmade guitar. Because guitars really, in the 20th century, were industrial objects primarily. And around the same time that you started making furniture, there were a number of people who started making guitars, but they all report similar things. There was one book. They couldn't learn. Nobody knew anyone else. People in different spots of the country had this realization that a guitar can be made by hand and that they were fascinated by it. They got the one book and tried to decipher, what was said about it. And the materials weren't available. The tools were barely available, so on and so forth. And, and so in Canada, we have a store called Lee Valley also, which you might be familiar with.
Oh, I know Lee Valley. Leonard Lee, who started it, was, I did not know him. I don't know if I ever met him personally, but to a certain extent, we had a relationship like this, but not in a bad way. It was just, he didn't think I knew how to sharpen.
Oh, they sell a lot of sharpening solutions at Lee Valley, a lot of different ones.
That's right. They do. That's right. I was a non-jig sharpener. I am a non-jig sharpener.
Yes.
I think one of the beauties of craftsmanship and is learning to trust and believe that you have skill in your hands. That you don't need jigs. That it's the pleasure of actually being able to do something well with these.
Yeah,
those guys. And it's also a really increasingly unusual experience in modern life, is to be able to trust your hands and develop those kinds of skills.
Now, this is an unusually technical conversation for me in this conversation, but are you really freehanding with an old whetstone, or are you using a plate of glass and multiple variations?
My sharpening is, and I don't know, my sharpening is that I maintain for chisels and plane irons, I maintain a bevel on a grinder, electric grinder. Okay. And then the honing is done on waterstones by hand.
On waterstones by hand. Yeah.
I have noticed I've been teaching for 40 years, let's say 45 years. And students are increasingly coming to rely on jigs to hold the chisel in the right angle as they ride it on the stone. And it works just fine. It's just a little more cumbersome to do than being able to pick it up and do it. And I'm still learning things. I'm sorry to be so technical, but it amazes me now in my shop every day. If I'm sharpening a chisel, there are things I'm noticing after 50 years that I did not notice 10 years ago. Like now I can tell by the feel of the way the chisel's dragging on the stone and the sound when the tip is fully engaged with the stone and I'm ready to move on to the next grid. I don't think I knew that 30 years ago.
Yeah, your awareness is growing.
Yeah, which is, again, a lovely thing.
Yeah. Yes. No, I mean, this is probably a very interesting conversation for the majority of our listeners who are handcrafters of musical instruments primarily. And but you can really go down that rabbit hole on this, and you can buy a lot of stuff, a lot of automated machines and jigs and plates of glass and different types of paper. And it's a real thing. But, I also remember when first handling a chisel and carving spruce braces, that when you haven't yet learned to realize you're working harder than you need to if you just stop and sharpen your chisel. And you sharpen your chisel and you go, oh my God, what was I doing? I was like hacking at this thing almost, because I didn't have the sharp tools. I didn't take the time to do it. And there's a learning curve to that. And I think that's really applicable across many things in your life. I came to woodworking actually quite late, comparatively speaking. I do a lot in my mind theoretically. I've done a lot of sales. I'm an entrepreneur, but I learned to make. Oh, it's a big reveal here. Actually, a lot of people don't know that I've ever made guitars. So here we go. I learned to make guitars much later in life, and it brought I feel like I finally came full circle. It was the last part for me, and ironically, I had sent my children to a Waldorf school where the teaching principles involve head, heart, and hands. And so they teach them about it, but they don't then ask them questions about it. They let them sleep on it overnight. So they tell them stories and they allow them to sort of feel it. And then they talk about it, and they make something. It's always, everything is making. Even a textbook in a Waldorf school, your kids get a blank sheet of paper within a book and they have to draw it out. And they learn to draw, like to write in straight lines, like the old calligraphers would. And but there really is a wholeness to us that involves our hands and the making of things. It's really hard to communicate to someone who hasn't I think you just have to do it.
It's also an awareness that's becoming increasingly elusive as society becomes ever more, as daily experience in society becomes ever more digitally active or virtual. So if you spend your time on a keyboard for work, and then you come in your leisure activity, you're still on a keyboard or your phone, which is sort of what modern life is. People more and more lose the experience, the haptic experience, whatever it's called, of doing things with your hands and finding the satisfactions that are inherent. And really, I don't think I'm going to go through the entire history of the idea of craft at the moment, but as I warned you in advance, I tend to go down a hole in my thinking, and then I can't get back to where I was these days. So
that's all right. Let's go there together.
Where I was going,
and we'll bring it back. So when we're talking about people living in a virtual realm, in a digital realm, and not having the hands-on experience in the same way, that we are losing it.
And what I was going to say is, you do know that in 1993, I founded a school that has become what's called the Center for Furniture Craftsmanship, a nonprofit school in Maine. And we have about 400 students a year, and it's a wonderful place. And I teach and have taught forever a 2-week basic woodworking course as a standalone course 5 times a year. And then it's also the introduction to our longer professional trainings at the school. And the one of the things, in certain way, craft has been disappearing ever since the rise of the Industrial Revolution, certainly as a way to make a living, practical way to make a living. Or many crafts have no longer practical ways to make a living. Some are. But at the same time that what we're doing is increasingly irrelevant economically to society, it becoming more and more relevant as people get more divorced from their physical ability to make things happen in the world that are actual and real. And so I think there's a hunger that means that as marginal as craft has become, schools like ours will become ever more desirable because people are hungry for satisfactions that they are not finding in ordinary life. And for example, in this course I teach, so 60 students a year, certainly a fair number of them are they're adults with successful lives, and they might be truck drivers, they might be lawyers, whatever they are, business people. But they've spent a lot of money to come to Maine for 2 weeks and to make a little bench, hardwood bench, that they could, even if they bought it from a fine woodworker, it would still only cost them $1,000. They've spent way more than that in time and money. They're not coming for the bench. They're coming because they're hungry for something they're not finding in their life. And they're imagining that by developing the skills to make something beautiful and real, it's tangible, they're going to find some sort of spiritual satisfaction that they're looking for, hungry for. And that's not a conscious thought for most people. But as far as I can see, that's the explanation. That's what's driving them. And so craft has, I'm maybe getting ahead of you in our conversation. But
No.
Craft has a place in our society as an alternative to the sort of as a way of providing alternative ways of finding meaning and fulfillment in life to what people generally get to experience anymore.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think it's exactly part of what I just said about that head, heart, and hands part of it. I think there are three parts to sort of how we operate. You know, our feelings, our mental and theoretical capacities, but also the doing. And the doing is really important, the hands-on part of it. And I see lots of expressions of this. What you're talking about, we see the same thing within the guitar community. There's a school I teach at every year in Belgium where it's almost completely adult students. And a lot of it is actually, I think, government funded, with people who are looking for a second career. And the government is saying, well, we'll educate you in something. And they're looking for something meaningful. I don't know that they educate a lot of people to go through for accounting. Not that accounting isn't meaningful, but you know what I mean? Like, these people are looking to do something that they're going to really care about in a different kind of way. Maybe like you mentioned, a lot of them are making very good money in other places, possibly, who also are looking for meaning, that they're not finding that fulfillment. And it's part of our sort of disenfranchisement from our physicality, I think.
Or our disenfranchisement from some essential parts of our humanity, of
Yes.
the actual biological makeup that we have. That informs our mentality and our experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. When you start to work with things with your hands, you understand materiality in a different way. And when you understand materiality, you understand how things come into being. And physics is the same, regardless of what material we're talking about. We can see really obviously in woodwork. One of the reasons I think that woodworking is so popular is that we can identify and look at the grain of the wood. And you can tell something about it fairly obviously within short order, that it grew in this direction, that it separates easily in this direction. But then you start to understand how the flowers and grow, but also not just that, it's everything that exists on the planet moves in the same way. And so when I started to understand materiality, when I started to understand the physics of sound and simplifying it, I was able to take that, and now I understand smell and taste, and not just sound and sight, everything else about it. And I began to realize how much the building blocks of all of this are the same. But that really led from having some contact with physical things and learning how to shape them. And learn how to shape them in a way where I cut my steak differently because I learned how to use a chisel. Right?
I completely get that, yes. And I have when you mentioned the book I wrote, and that came out in 2013, Why We Make Things and Why It Matters. And just, if I may explain how that came about, that
Please.
book. I became a furniture maker after college in the early 1970s. I was a carpenter for 2 years first. And I did not know any other craftspeople. One didn't encounter them in very much in ordinary life at that time. And I was learning in a vacuum. And but I was for 12 years a self-employed professional furniture maker. And during that time, I started showing in craft shows, and then craft galleries, and then art galleries. And in 1981, when I had my first solo show in an art gallery, I had to write an artist statement. And I wrote that what I was trying to do was create furniture that had the qualities of integrity and simplicity and grace. And where I'm going to with that, because there's something else I'll come back to, is that, what I'll say is then about 10 years after that, I was in a writing seminar with an art critic where myself and several other people in other media were writing artist statements. And it really crystallized for me there that I had become a furniture maker not because I wanted to create furniture that had integrity and simplicity and grace. I did, but it was because I imagined that by learning the skills of furniture making and practicing them daily, I was going to cultivate the qualities of integrity and simplicity and grace within myself. So I came to this, that was, I mean, that I had in words, but it was more of a gut truth than anything else. And I realized once I figured that out, that the reason people engage in pretty much every creative arts field, visual arts or dance or writing, whatever it is because we go into the studio, the workshop, not knowing what we're going to make. That's the point of the creative process. It's a process of discovery. And we imagine, and it's true, that in the process of creating something that's never existed before, we actually learn more ourselves. For my generation, learn more about who we are and what our potential is for what we can become. And one of the great satisfactions of craft as a way of doing that, there's many ways of pursuing a creative endeavor and not only learning more about who you can be and changing in the process, but at the same time, you're discovering, whether purposely, whether you're consciously or not, when you explore who you are as a human being, you're actually exploring what human potential is in general. And one of the great things about craft as a way of doing that is the degree to which, to get back to what you were saying, because it deals with physical materials, it grounds you in reality. So I'm going off down this other road, but when I realized that I was pursuing craft really as a process of self-discovery and self-transformation, and that's what applies to all arts, I started to then, again, that was a gut feeling. I started to ask myself more like, why is that the case? What does that mean? And in 2005, I said to myself, I've been sort of thinking about this and getting nowhere for years. I'm going to start writing about it. And I promised myself I would write at least one word a day to explore these ideas and try to actually untangle things and ground my ideas in reality. And for 5 years, I wrote at least one word a day. And that came with ended in the first manuscript for Why We Make Things. And I'm getting back to grounding in reality. What I realize is, or the way I like to summarize what's beautiful about craft is, you can't bullshit a chisel. We all operate with mental maps of how the world works and how we fit into it. Yeah. And these mental maps are really flawed because we can never possibly understand reality as it is. Yes. And we ask our mental maps to do things for us that don't necessarily result in accurate pictures of the world, like make us feel good about ourselves. And in many creative endeavors, like writing, for example, because they're not grounded in the real, there's no check on your thoughts, so to speak. You can go into all kinds of places that don't work. But in guitar making or furniture making, you're dealing with real materials in the real world. When you go off course, or when you're doing something that doesn't work, when your chisel's dull, you can't pretend it's not dull. Right. And one of the lovely things, again, about woodworking and guitar making, I'm sure, lutherie, is that the quality of what you do depends on the integrity with which you've done every previous step in the process. And that is so unlike the world we live in that we see on television or anywhere, where all that matters in the long run is what things look like and are perceived as they're done. However good or not good, lasting or not lasting, whatever level of integrity went into them. But again, you can't pretend with real materials. And that's one aspect of them that grounds people in the reality of the world in a way that doesn't happen online.
Yeah. And
that was a long answer.
Well, it's okay because the thing about it is, in the end, the results show it, right? You have a made object, and that's when you can no longer deny it. And so when you're talking about that, I'm remembering learning making acoustic guitars and kind of skimping a little bit on sanding the sides of the guitar, because that sucks. No one wants to do that. So you steam bend the sides, you heat them up, you bend them into shape, but they don't come out really perfectly flat. They come out a little bit warbly. So you have to sand them down and get them really level, and you have to check to make sure they're level. You can kind of ignore it a little bit, but then you cut a binding channel that's based on the sides, and it's based on the relationship of the sides to the top and the angle that you have there. And then you do your binding and you scrape your binding back, and why is my binding thinner in some spots and thicker in the other spots? And you realize, shit, that was 5 steps ago. You didn't get right. And in the end, you can tell you didn't do that because the purfling and the binding that you put on it is inconsistent. Right. And that's directly related to the work that you did 5 steps earlier. The funny thing is, relationships are no different. I heard somebody once tell an intellectual. I think someone made a comment to, perhaps it was Jordan Peterson. They said, you're very brave, Mr. Peterson, for saying what you're saying. He said that's not right. I'm not brave. I'm just experienced enough to know that it's a much worse hell if I ignore this later down the road. I'm not brave. I'm preventing myself from the pain that I know is coming later. And so, you can be willfully, you can deny yourself reality, and you can live in a fantasy if you want, but that's really hard to do with a made object. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Otherwise, cognitive dissonance is so central to our lives, ignoring facts that we don't want to confront. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, there's so many parallels between, we're both humans living in a real world where physics apply. And I got to tell you, Peter, when I read your book, it's happened to me twice in my life now where I read a book and went, son of a bitch, he wrote my book. Because I haven't written a book, but I've been writing a book. And this book has so many of the concepts and realities that I talk about in my daily life, because I'm one of the people who works primarily with craftspeople, helping them through these things. And you've lived a life with a great deal of experience, and you talk about your experiences as you work through them, the conclusions you came to, and you bolster them with great rational thinking. You give wonderful examples. And honestly, that's a lot of what my work is just helping people process through the issues, helping people with them. And I really, I really appreciate it. And your book was recommended to me from a guitar maker who has had a series of careers in craft. I'll get a little shout out. That's Mark Guerrero. Mark Guerrero lives in Portland, Oregon now, and he was a student of one of the master guitar makers, Irvin Samaji. But he used to make armatures for like animations, remember Claymation and the California Raisins and the movie Coraline. He worked in the movie Coraline, and he's obviously serious about handcrafting. And this part of his life anyways is about making guitars. And we were talking, and he was the first person to point out, says, Jamie, your perspective on this, I think you'd probably really enjoy Peter Korn's work. And he recommended your book.
That was very nice of him. So some people like that book and some people don't like that book. So I'm glad you found one that liked it. Yeah.
Well, I don't know anybody who works in craft, certainly any guitar maker who's being honest with themselves, who wouldn't find valuable perspective in that book. Cognitive dissonance, perhaps, as you already mentioned. But if we're being honest with ourselves, there's a great deal of human experience in here. You're quite open about your past, about how you went from university into craft, your struggles with cancer. You're a cancer survivor, right? I think you've had a couple of bouts with it where things were not looking good, that you made it through.
And since then, a brain hemorrhage. Yeah.
Right.
Since I wrote the book.
Wow.
And yet I'm quite lucky. Yes.
And you look to me like a healthy guy on the other side of this computer screen anyways. And we've had a few close calls, and you've been around and done a lot of really fantastic things, and you've shared that with us. And so,
well, I'll tell you, knowing that we were going to have this discussion, I haven't been doing public events or speaking since the pandemic started, in part because I'm very careful of my health. But I reread or skimmed through the book myself yesterday evening in preparation for the talk. And, coming to it after 13 years or whatever, 12 years after it was published, it's so, like I said, I'm sure this is true for everyone who does something similar. It's a distillation of the best of me. It's way better than I actually am, if you will, because it's so carefully parsed and edited and put together, and the clarity of the ideas and the flow. I couldn't do that again today, being now 72 years old.
Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we're dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com.
Let's close one of the loops that you started earlier on, and that was that when you had to write a description for an art gallery about your work, you realized, did you say it? I know the answer. So
I said it. I said that 10 years after saying I was trying to create furniture that had the qualities of integrity and simplicity and grace, I realized that is what I was really trying to do within myself by learning to make furniture. Now, what I think may be of interest to guitar makers, that's part of my experience as well, is that we live in a world and have lived in a world for centuries where the work of the hand, making useful, beautiful things, is basically takes a distant second in status and in earning power to the fine arts. And that you can call that the Cartesian divide. It's something that started in the Renaissance, that divide between valuing the life, what was called the life of the mind, and devaluing what was called the life of the body. So I grew up in a world where, the status and the publicity and everything else that goes to the art world is honoring a conversation. The art world is a long-term conversation where things are valued according to primarily at the top end, fame and money. Those are the measures of success. And those are not measures that very many guitar makers or fine woodworkers get to ever contemplate fame, real fame or success. In our field, we might look for it. And oh my God, I've just lost myself again. Oh,
the Cartesian divide. And
going back to your. So when I stopped being a furniture maker in 1986, because I realized I was never going to make an adult living at it because of my flaws as a businessman, really. I took a job for 6 years at Anderson Ranch Art Center in Colorado, where I was the woodworking program director, running a summer workshop program. And Anderson Ranch is unusual in that it is a nonprofit institution that combines education in crafts with fine art. So there was printmaking, and there was painting, there was drawing, but there was also ceramics, there was woodworking, and when I first started, there was fibers and fiber art. And that was the first time in my life where I was exposed to people in other media. And the predominant ethos or viewpoint of the Anderson Ranch board and staff of that world was to adopt the values of the art world, which said that in your work, what mattered was novelty and in a sense, conceptuality. And there was a lot of suspicion of beauty and utility. And I was coming from a place, again, where I had that deep feeling in my gut that when people design and build useful, beautiful things like furniture or like guitars, they can be engaging in an exploration of what matters about being human, what's important in life, as people in any art form whatsoever.
Yes.
And that conviction is something, again, which I worked through logically to explain and why we make things and why it matters, which meant sort of figuring out how the human mind works in an explicable way, at least from my point of view. But it's also why I moved to Maine to start a school. I wanted there to be an institution in the United States that in the crafts fields, in my field, woodworking, stood up for the idea that making useful, beautiful things is or can be a really important expression and exploration of what it means to be human. And that's sort of my bottom line there in terms of professionally what I've tried to achieve or achieved is starting the school and writing about that idea in a way that at least in some way may contribute to the ongoing conversation that happens in our world.
Wonderful. And very close to my heart. I've been involved in a number of projects and efforts to engage the fine art world with guitars that at least guitar makers feel cross the line. But there have been examples where a group of very artistic guitar makers has gone to Japan to be a part of an art show there, invited by a gallery, but the organizers of the show had them removed.
That
basically,
hurts. Yeah.
They eventually agreed to limit the amount of guitars in the space and have them on a rotation throughout the show. So they couldn't have a volume of guitars that exceeded X amount. But yeah, it's difficult because honestly, many of those guitar makers are fine art majors who chose to, they've been artists their entire lives and they express themselves through the guitar. As a matter of fact, my first interview this morning was with Nikolai Schor, who is a fine art major in Germany who lives in Berlin, who makes very artistic, beautiful, but functional guitars. And, when you talk about building something meaningful, I think about, if it's okay if I share with you a moment, there's a guitar maker by the name of Michihiro Matsuda, a Japanese-born guitar maker who's been living in California now for a few decades. But Michi makes artistic expressions often. And he made a guitar a few years ago where he works one day a week as a guitar repair person at a guitar store in his area to keep himself sort of grounded in reality of what everyone else is doing. Yeah. It's a great way to learn. A lot of guitar makers really feel like engaging and fixing other instruments is a great way to understand things. And so Michi still does this one day a week, even though he has a 4-year wait on his guitars and is quite successful in what he does. But people bring in an inexpensive guitar and they want their kid to start taking lessons. And this is their dad's guitar or something of the sort. Say, can you fix this? And the answer often is, it's going to cost like $800 to fix this, and that $200 guitar over there, honestly, is a better instrument. And so, do you want to spend $800 fixing this one, or do you want to spend $200 and buy that one? And most of the time, they say, "I'll spend the $200." And the old is a relic, an antique now for a decoration, not a functional instrument. And Michi wondered what happens with these instruments, and so he got on Craigslist and bought a guitar that he knew wasn't going to work, like a copy of an iconic guitar, a copy of a Les Paul. And he cut it up and he took other objects that were deemed not valuable or not worth fixing anymore. And there's a Japanese, and please excuse me, all of the Japanese people, if I say this wrong. I believe the Japanese word is motenai. And the philosophy is basically to stop and consider before you throw something away. So we're going to pause for a moment and say, is this still useful? Can we make use of it? And so he took this broken guitar and he took a kitchen table that had been in his workshop for 10 years, not really being used. He got a broken piano soundboard from another instrument maker, and he contacted his friend. He's very socially aware as well. He contacted his friend who has a sushi restaurant, who of course throw out tons and tons of these little disposable chopsticks every day. And it's a huge issue, environmentally speaking. the popularity of sushi and the amount of the world who uses chopsticks as their main eating utensil. And so he got a bag of dirty used chopsticks from the day. I'm sure he cleaned them up and put them through a cyclic sander. But he reconstructed a musical instrument using this piano soundboard, the guitar, a new neck, everything up. It was 3 layers of chopsticks over top of each other. And he made this really stunningly beautiful and interesting guitar with the idea of, can I bring value to things that were deemed not valuable or no longer valuable? I mean, if that's not an artistic expression, I don't know what is.
It is.
You can tune it and you can play music on it, and therefore the fine art, or the portion of the fine art world who says that disqualifies you from.
So we're in different subfields, but we experience the same social prejudices, so to speak.
Yes. Yeah. I remember going to the MoMA for the first time in New York, and there was an exhibition of American furniture makers that were inspired by Chinese, Japanese, let's just sort of say the Far Eastern design. And they had made things that were referencing that. And again, I'm looking at furniture in the MoMA, and I remember them describing, there was a particular dynasty, I don't remember the dynasty, where it was fashionable to disdain modern design. And so they would put a pedestal outside the front of their home, and they'd put a rock, or they'd put a root structure on the pedestal. And that was to say, a human can never achieve anything as beautiful as what nature has made, and that we disdain natural, or we disdain human production, that this is really more beautiful. And, it's all perspective, isn't it? It's all narrative.
Yes. Well, one of the things I've come to see in terms of the divide between the art world and the craft world is that again, this goes back to me having to sort of get a bigger picture in order to explore what I wanted to explore in the book. But I've come to see that human beings are almost, an analogy might be that, I'll say this differently. Today, each of us lives with this idea of ourselves that we are pretty much fully autonomous individuals with free will. And we live quite independently of society. We can choose to participate where we want and where we don't want, but we're pretty freestanding. And interestingly enough, historically, let's just say through 10,000 years of history that we have, that's a very new idea. And even 150 years ago, most people I'll just talk about Western civilization. That's what I know best.
Sure.
They really pictured themselves there in terms of being an individual versus being part of a collective, pictured themselves more as part of the collective. And the idea that we're fully autonomous individuals is true to some extent. I mean, we do have free will. We create things. We make decisions. We do have that freedom. But what we've lost sight of is the degree to which we're actually even more deeply embedded in the whole, like cells in the human body, where each cell has its own life, but it's part of a much larger function of participating. And that being the case, I also see that, when we're born and then throughout our lives, what we mainly do as human beings, besides eat and breathe and reproduce, is we each construct a picture of how the world works that we're constantly maintaining and changing, because that's how we adapt, and that's how we survive, and that's how we thrive. And those pictures, those mental maps of the world, happen like this. You're born into a certain place in time, and there's the cultural conversation that you're born into is where you pick up the bits and pieces that are going to form your individual mental map. And then you change it with experience, to some extent, firsthand experience. But whatever you think is really communicable to other people, whether you intend it or not. You're part of a whole. And so you're kind of born into a river of ideas that's flowing through time, and that's civilization. And you swim around in it for a while. Hopefully you contribute something of value to it. And then you die out of it and the river goes on. And that's true of the big whole, but it's also true of fields. So for fine arts, for example, if you're going to succeed in the fine arts is a conversation that's been happening and changing for hundreds of years, not thousands of years, but hundreds of years. And people go to art school, from my point of view, fine art school, to get indoctrinated into that conversation, which includes not only learning the conversation, how it works, but being able to participate and contribute to it in ways that an outsider, a person who grew up in craft like me or in guitar making, will never speak that language. We're not indoctrinated into. I'm in the conversation of craft, among others. It's a different conversation. So the fields are different because, in a sense, the participants in the fields are asking different types of questions and have very different basic views about what matters in life.
Yes. Yeah, a very familiar topic for me. I literally describe one of our primary business roles. I'm as the curator of the Boutique Guitar Showcase, one of our businesses. When people contact me to see if they can participate in it, this is what I say to them. I say, thank you for contacting me. We focus on unique, world-class instruments that are contributing to the conversation of the guitar. If you feel that you're making a unique, world-class instrument that's contributing to the conversation, please tell me all about it. Very pleased to meet you. But it's that contribution. What are you contributing to the conversation that someone else is not contributing? Or that maybe you're contributing, frankly, a more refined or clear vision of it, and you can do that. Someone can come along and supersede someone else who was occupying that part of the conversation, and we evolve in that way. But that conversation is really important. And then furthermore, there's a second part of the work that I like to do that maybe we can overlay into this conversation, where I really enjoy engaging with people of other creative disciplines. Here we are, you and me right now, where we can learn those questions. We can learn those contributions. We can learn the language set. We can learn, what exactly is important to you when you see this, or how do you view this topic? And so last year, me and an architect from New York, Ed Keller, and Ed has taught at the New School in Columbia, and I think he's at RISD, all over the place. And he was a curator at the Venice Biennale, the Biennale of Architecture. And we put together, him and I, a symposium where we dealt with the materiality of sound, we dealt with the icon, and we dealt with the gesture. But the main part that I wanted to do on that materiality of sound was to bring together different disciplines so we could learn the language sets and perhaps develop an agreed upon lexicon. Because what I find is when we're talking about something like sound, an acoustic engineer talks about it differently than a violin maker does or a guitar maker does, than an architect does, right? And so then a neuroscientist does. And so we brought together neuroscientists, AI specialists, engineers, instrument makers, architects, acoustic engineers, all to have this sort of common conversation. And one person spends their whole day designing violin strings. Another person spends their day, treating acoustic spaces within architecture. But in the end, we're still dealing with the same physics. And so what questions are you asking? What solutions have you found? And maybe we can agree upon the terms, and that moves us all forward.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you're going to agree upon the terms because you each have a different design brief that you're addressing. Right. The problem you're setting out to answer at the beginning is slightly different. The physics are the same, but the problems are different. How does sound echo in a space, or how narrow is the range of vibration of a string, or whatever it is that you would describe. But it sounds like it was really an enjoyable thing that everyone would enlarge everyone's point of view.
It is, but what you learn is when someone else describes something, you can say, why did you use that word? Because it's not a word that you would have used, and you recognize, you go, it's not wrong, but that's interesting. Why did you choose to use that word? And you ask them. And then all of a sudden your perspective on things shifts just a little bit. Right? And so, I learned a little bit about the philosopher Hegel has a philosophy where he observes, actually it's a political philosophy, where he observes that every thesis generates its own antithesis that generates its own synthesis. Mm-hmm. And it was in this context, which becomes a new thesis. You're familiar with it, yes. But honestly, and this may sound ridiculous to you, but it was in reading this that for the first time I looked at the word antithesis as antithesis and synthesis. All of a sudden I went, of course, Jamie, you idiot, but it's context. And it's when someone spells it out for you. And in that scenario, I don't see a more clear way of explaining those words, except actually by the using of Hegel's theory, actually, or observation, let's say. And so when you engage with people of other disciplines, you learn what they're doing, why they're doing it, and you might, it's always something to learn. Always something.
So have you ever read a book by Lewis Hyde called The Gift?
I have not.
I highly recommend it. I might argue with it in places, but it was written, I believe, in the 1970s. It could have been the 80s. And he's describing the creative process in a way that is another person who does that is Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. But in the same way that I tried to explain it earlier, which is that we all exist in the same stream or river. If we engage in creative activities, we are challenging received ideas, inherently challenging them because we're trying to do something new. We're going to learn from, right? We learn something or we don't learn something. But whatever we learn feeds back through us, whether intentionally or not, into the larger whole of conversation. And informs it, and in the arts, then eventually, if we do something significant, becomes the new thesis or the new basis from which people coming into the field start exploring without realizing that we've challenged something that exists before. So for Lewis Hyde, he describes art making as much like the Pacific Northwest Native Americans used to regard property, where it's an exchange of gifts that keeps going around rather than an ownership of one thing. It's real. I can't explain why it's good, but try it.
You wrote about that in your book a little bit. Not exactly that, but there was a part.
Him. Yeah.
Do you? Sorry. There is a part where I actually took it as a note to talk about with you.
I know where the quote is.
You said ideas are relevant. They pass from person to person, other makers, academics, critics, merchants, collectors, and the general populace, and each one potentially adding his own charge until finally the current returns to the maker or the next generation of makers in the form of new cultural orthodoxy with which to wrestle all over again.
If only I could verbalize that.
Well put, Mr. Korn.
Verbalize it in conversation. That is what I'm talking about. And that comes back to this idea that I have, or perception I have, that one of the actually serious problems with the world we live in is that we so grossly dismiss or underestimate the extent to which each of us is part of a whole. And that contributes to the fractioning of political life and many other things, to the general disregard for the environment. Even though it seems like there is a lot of regard for the environment, it's not nearly appropriate to the scale of the problem, for example, in my estimation.
Are you serious about the business of guitar? Then you need to join us on Patreon. We're building a future where guitar makers are able to live prosperous lives making instruments that inspire the musical experience, which helps to create a more beautiful world. where others who are passionate about the guitar can thrive. Those who help in the promotion and resale, trade shows, writing of books and articles are supported as a valuable part of the community. A community where we explore with curiosity and encourage those around us in their endeavors. With a community effort, we can accomplish far more than we can individually. So let's be serious about your guitar business and join us on Patreon at patreon.com/business of guitar. That's patreon.com/business of guitar. So there's so much good work that you did, Peter. It's so well written. There's honestly, I have on my phone 27 photographs of pages that are stopped, highlighted, that I thought, oh, I need to come back to these things. And so, thank you for that. So let me just grab one of those little bits that I pulled off of my phone again in preparation for this, and we'll just dive into that a little bit. So when you talk about, so you say it would be difficult to overemphasize the degree to which materiality of craft in particular and creative work in general are effective sources of fulfillment, meaning and identity for both the maker and the respondent. We think with materials and objects at least as much as we think with words, perhaps far more. They are conduits through which we construct ourselves and our world. So, that's a pretty strong statement about objects versus words. And so can you expound on that?
Well, that was part of what I learned through writing the book and sort of challenging my own beliefs or asking for the groundwork to support them. And and wondering, exactly how does the making of a table or the design and making of a chair, what's really happening there? And so there's sort of three levels on which we work as creative people. There's the fact that we choose to do it first and foremost because it's something that we are going to take value out of for ourselves. And that's the part where I'm talking, which I've already mentioned, where we're actually exploring. We go into the studio not knowing, essentially it's this: the world isn't asking anyone to come up with a new and better guitar, really, or a new and better chair. It doesn't value them that much. We go into the studio because we expect to come out of the other end of the creative process different ourselves, knowing more or somehow being different. That difference may be venal. We may want to become richer and more famous, right? But it's often not that. It's often trying to explore other or gain other human values. So that's sort of the impetus where creative work comes from. But if you just do your creative work in a vacuum and you don't share it, first of all, no one does it in a vacuum. If you're writing, or if I'm writing, I'm always hearing my sentences on the page when I read them through the ear of a prospective reader, right? You always, if you're making furniture, you have the use in mind, how people are going to respond to it, those sorts of things. Well, it's when you send your work out into the world that in a sense your work joins the broader conversation of society. And the second level, after your experience on which that happens, is the experience of an individual who's personally interacting with the thing you've made. So the person who picks up your guitar and actually starts to play it and may be highly skilled and know what they're hearing and feeling, right? That's the effect of your work and what it may communicate about the questions you've asked and the answers you've come up with in your work to a user, person experiencing directly. But there's a third realm in which our work exists, and that's where it's not so much someone experiencing the work in person, because how many people are going to pick up one individual guitar? It's the world where what we do is broadcast or made available to large audiences through media, really, through the internet, but through books, through reviews, through academic courses, those sorts of things. That's how most people learn about most creative work. And by the time they've learned that, they're not experiencing the real thing. They're experiencing it through someone else's agenda, the writer's agenda or the reviewer's agenda or the gallery owner's agenda, but they're still getting some exposure. And it's that third world where our work really has the potential to communicate with other people, however watered down, and inform the culture. And that goes back to what you were talking about. That's the cycle where if the work gets that far, to the extent it informs the culture, it then helps form the basis for the next generation's exploration.
Yes.
So there's that. That isn't exactly what you began to talk about, but that's where my mind went.
Yeah. No, that's great. And you actually went into, you touched on one of the other things I did want to talk to you about, actually. And that was, you talked about the context of creativity there a little bit. No, it's actually not on this note, but I will try and paraphrase. You mentioned in your book that once you create an object and send it out to the world, it becomes its own thing, and it'll start to gather its own experiences and its own history. Would you mind saying that better than I just did?
Yeah, and one of the programs I started at the Center for Furniture Craftsmanship is the fellowship program, where we have a 5,000 square foot building and all its workshop building, and all it's used for, and I don't mean that in a diminishing way, what it's used for is we give free workshop space to emerging makers to explore new ideas and techniques in their work. And they can come for anywhere from a month to a year, depending on how long they apply for and what they're accepted for. And some of those positions now are funded as well. And I go to the critiques every 2 weeks, where the 6 people who are participating would share what they're doing with the rest of the makers in the program and some of the faculty like myself. And one of the things I ended up, the younger makers I see are all about the theory behind what they're doing. You know, they want to, they have all these ideas about making work that talks about the environment and the political structure and the, you know, inequity in culture and stuff. And you do have to start somewhere. I mean, that's all wonderful. We all start with something. But what I explain over and over is, once you've made the work, none of that goes with it. When someone encounters your chair or your painting or whatever, they're just dealing with the object. And for that reason, there's a distinction I make between two things: meaning and information. And this is, you know, one of the things about this book we're discussing is I really worked to make it sounds simpler than it is. That's the best way to say it. So what I've come to see is that what I call information is the fact that the thing you make is a record of the step-by-step decisions you made, of the questions you asked, and the step-by-step decisions you made in answering them during the creative process. So that would include your design brief. In some cases, that might be, I would like to make a guitar. It may be a commission for someone and they're describing the brief. It may be that you're trying to explore new ideas in guitar making, whatever it is, right? And then you have to make decisions. What am I going to use? What's the shape? What glue? All those things, right? Then the finished thing has all that information in it. It's actually a set in concrete record of every decision you've made. So the piece the thing you make always contains information. But the thing you make has no meaning intrinsic to it. Meaning is always what any individual person is projecting onto something. So if you think about, let's say I make a chair, or someone makes a guitar, and somehow 10,000 years from now, when humanity isn't around anymore, a visitor from space comes and finds the guitar, right? Well, that guitar has no meaning to communicate at all. I mean, the meaning died with the human beings who would have projected whatever they cared about and thought of onto it, right? Yep. So there's that difference between meaning and information. Now, why I got onto that topic again, I have to apologize once again, but don't
That's
know
all
how
right.
I get back to where we were.
I asked you to take the concept that you talked about in your book about when you make an object and send it out to the world, it begins to gather its own history and its own narrative.
Yes.
That you don't get to send out, and your students who are putting political ideas and such into their concepts, you said that's all kind of lost once it leaves the room or once it ships to someone else.
Yes, well,
right.
That's it. Well, you just summarized what I was trying to say. So that was that topic. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting when you get to something scalable, and then when something has become large enough, it's had that success that we talked about that has then influenced culture, which now influences you in return. When you get to a company that's responsible for maintaining that legacy, it's really fascinating that can be a lot of investment into maintaining the narrative and maintaining the meaning around it, because the meaning that was cultural because a particular musician played a particular instrument at a culturally significant moment, if that has been the thing that has fueled your success for decades, but those people start to die and the next generation doesn't care so much about it, then you find yourself potentially in a position where you start to tell everyone that it matters, and you end up in a hegemonic position where you have a marketing department that just tells people we're the best over and over again. And there are companies like that. And let's just use an example. It's neither furniture nor guitars for a moment. I think Harley Davidson's in this problem. Harley Davidson's in this problem because they benefited from at one point in time, they were technologically sufficient for everyone else, but then they really benefited from the whole Easy Rider thing and the culture that grew up around bikes. But the new generation is much more interested in, the people who continue to evolve and advance the technology, where Harley Davidson, really fed and recycled their icon a great deal.
Right. Well, rise and fall is the story of everything. I mean, not just businesses, but ideologies, points of view, religions, everything. I mean, it seems like every generation, how can I say, every generation seems to need to reword the eternal truth of life in a fresh language. In other words, we grow up reading the truths from many past civilizations. They're all the same truth. It just stated different ways, really, and about human existence and the nature of existence. But every generation has to, again, start from that and then put it in their own words and build it. And that's your synthesis, thesis, antithesis cycle, endlessly playing. And that's true of businesses too. And when I started the Center for Furniture Craftsmanship in 1993, my goal was to create a sustainable national institution that would, advocate for the value of making useful, beautiful things. But I also knew that you can start a nonprofit or an institution and it can become successful, which the center has. But over time, that mission, so to speak, is either going to become irrelevant or be changed because of other pressures from society. Things change. And that's one thing you take as a given. So in a sense, in starting the school, I knew that someday I was going to leave and that institutions have short memories. I was going to have done what I did, and whatever you do becomes a given for the next generation. They don't know how hard you worked to do it or what was there before you did it, right? And that's the cycle of life. Yeah.
That touches on, actually, remember I mentioned there were 2 books that I've read where I went, shit, this guy wrote my book. The other book is a book written by an author named Chuck Klosterman, who wrote a book called But What If We're Wrong? And it basically goes through many scenarios where we were wrong. and he puts forth an idea as to why we're so bad at predicting, why we're so bad at saying this is the way it's going to be. And really, not to ruin the book for everyone, it's a really worthy read, a worthwhile read. But what it comes down to is we can predict trajectories of products and ideas to a certain extent, but what we can't predict is the values and the needs of the culture 20 years from now, or 30 years from now, or 100 years from now, whatever it happened to be, right? So, 100 years ago, there was a raging debate as to whether people who had different skin colors should share water fountains and sidewalks. Like, that's insane to us now. Like, absolutely insane to anybody living, right? But, and whether women should vote. That also just sounds ridiculous to us now. But there's so many ideas that were ridiculous. I mean, actually, I learned something recently that, the airport I fly into here is Pisa, which is Galileo Galilei. And Galileo, of course, was famously imprisoned, under house arrest, but imprisoned nonetheless as a heretic because the conception of the world was based on Dante's Divine Comedy and how he describes the world and hell and how it all functions together. And he said, no, the earth is not the center of the universe. The sun is.
Right. He was a non-Copernican, I believe.
Yeah. And so I learned last week that Dante's has a single digit on display in Florence.
One finger.
One
relic.
One relic.
For a woodworker, that's scary.
Just guess which one it is. Yeah. It seems like great karma that they just have one finger from Dante in a glass. I forget what they call it. It's basically a relic box on display in Florence. We're going to see it because it's just so hard to predict what things are like in the future, and that's the reason that we have a hard time getting it right. But I think that we can observe is there are universal truths that, like what you just talked about, there's sort of the rise and fall, but that sounds, it's true, but it sounds maybe more negative than I mean it to, because it's not good or bad. It just is, in the way of when it comes to culture and arts, often what we're talking about is the exploration of ideas. And we have an idea and we create things, we explore it, we talk about it, and eventually we kind of say everything there is to say about it. And there's nothing more to really explore so much in it. And that's when the movement kind of closes and we say, everything sounds the same, or it all looks derivative of what sort of came before it. But then there's always a new idea. And we explore the next idea. That's the next movement that happens. That's how
whether
we move.
We've exhausted it or not, we get used to it. It becomes part of the given world, is what it does.
Sure. And we see it in our architecture from, Nouveau to Deco and Brutalist and so on and so forth. It's just a number of people on a broader scale exploring a particular set of ideas until we've got bored of it, as you might say, or kind of said it all. We might revisit it later on when new information is added. We might come back to it and then synthesize, right? In the Hegel sort of way of looking at it. And but there is those ideas, the concepts of creative destruction, that something else comes on that meets the need better, or will mean the old thing is not
the perception of needs also changes, and maybe somewhat randomly. So from my point of view, the central or the highest quality of human beings that we have is the ability to come up with ideas and bring them into the world. To change the world intentionally, whether for better or worse. And we never stop doing it, right? There's a phrase, man is an elaborating animal. And it's so true. Someone starts, just look at things that go through society like the farm to table movement, or they start making one flavor of Pop-Tart and now there's 15 flavors. Right. Man is an elaborating animal and needs that change. And when I think of what the whole is that we belong to as individuals, I'll call it civilization. I hope that's an okay word. it is basically a current of ideas that flows through time, as I've already explained, and we participate in it for a while. It's always changing, and the central conversation is always, what is it to be human, and what is possible? What ought we to be? Not only what are we, but what ought we to be? And to go back to part of my thesis, when you go into the studio to create something that's never existed before, it may be for entirely personal reasons. But when you're doing it, when you're asking, who am I and what can I become, you are, whether purposely or not, taking part in that larger conversation of society. What is humanity? And you're contributing to it, whether you intend to or not. And that is, I guess, why in creative work, it can be so ultimately spiritually satisfying, is because you're taking part in the one conversation that truly matters and never stops and always changes.
Wonderfully said. And that is why we make things and why it matters, right?
That is.
Peter, thank you so much for the conversation today. I think that's a wonderful spot to wrap up here. Just in closing, I'd like to give the guests the last opportunity. Was there something today that you hoped that we would talk about that maybe I didn't address, that if I were a better interviewer, I might have asked you?
No, I enjoyed it a lot, and we covered everything that mattered to me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Jamie.
So for our guest today, Peter and I are going to continue on the conversation for another 5 to 10 minutes on the business of guitar, which in this case will be the business of creativity. There's a topic I'm really burning to discuss with him that I really appreciate in these changing days. And so if you want to hear our business discussion, then please head on over to patreon.com/the business of guitar. We put that behind a paywall because, frankly, it's inside business talk sometimes that just shouldn't be public knowledge. And so if you're in the business, then head over to patreon.com/business of guitar, and you'll hear Peter and I discuss a little bit further from there. So thanks for watching or listening. Thank you for watching and listening. You can find more episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts. And a special thanks to those who support us on Patreon. It's your support that enables us to do this work.